Kirby je vais faire mon introduction très courte en français et l'intervention de Vicki sera en anglais. Elle a eu la générosité de faire un PowerPoint pour aussi aider dans la lecture. Et pour la discussion, vous pourrez poser vos questions aussi bien en français qu'en anglais et moi, je me chargerai de traduire, même si Vicki KIRBY parle parfaitement bien le français et le comprend encore mieux que même les locuteurs natifs parfois. Donc nous avons, voilà, c'est un honneur de vous recevoir, surtout que vous venez de loin et à travers un voyage, un périple pour venir jusqu'à nous, donc nous en sommes vraiment très reconnaissants et reconnaissantes. Donc Vicki KIRBY est professeure émérite à l'Université de Nouvelle-Galles du Sud à Sidney en Australie et son travail, enfin, disons que c'était une évidence pour nous de l'accueillir dans ce séminaire sur l'histoire et la philosophie du structuralisme, car sa trajectoire intellectuelle a été en quelque sorte à tracer le chemin, la route, la voie que nous avons nous-mêmes menée dans ce séminaire depuis plusieurs années, c'est-à-dire que Vicki KIRBY, comme elle me le disait elle-même, a d'abord découvert l'œuvre de Saussure et le concept de systématicité, avant en fait de se tourner vers la question du féminisme du corps, et notamment dans un dialogue étroit avec Judith Butler, pour finalement contribuer à l'émergence de ce dont on a parlé à plusieurs reprises dans ce séminaire, des nouveaux matérialismes, alors aussi là encore dans un dialogue, un débat aussi interne, et pour arriver plus récemment à des questions d'ontologie quantique à travers les questions d'ontologie de la superposition et d'ontologie énergétique, où, je crois qu'il en est question aujourd'hui, par exemple, vous avez aussi beaucoup dialogué avec Karen Barad, dont on a également présenté les travaux dans ce séminaire. Donc, disons que voilà, c'était une évidence, puisque c'est vraiment la trajectoire que nous avons nous-mêmes suivie au cours de ces dernières années. Et votre travail s'inscrit plus largement dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler dans un féminisme de la déconstruction, puisque et on en parle, et peut-être que vous avez une réponse, mais il semble d'avoir eu un pôle en Australie de philosophes féministes travaillant avec et en prolongement du structuralisme. Donc, vous avez fait partie de cette constellation-là. Il y a eu cette revue Australian Feminist Studies qui a été un marqueur important. Et vous avez pris, disons, à bras le corps, si je puis dire, la question des sciences, de la biologie, de la nature, en radicalisant le geste de Derrida du « il n'y a pas de hors texte » à « il n'y a pas de hors nature », si la nature elle-même est écrivante, scripture et langage. Et aujourd'hui, votre intervention s'appelle Originary Humanity. Et c'était très important pour nous de vous accueillir dans ce séminaire, de contribuer aussi à faire connaître votre travail en France ou dans l'espace francophone. Je mentionne peut-être à titre autopromotionnel que dans l'anthologie que j'ai dirigée et qui va paraître en avril 2026 des nouveaux matérialismes, nous avons traduit un texte de Vicki KIRBY, et il me semble, aux presses universitaires de France, cette anthologie s'appelait dans la collection métaphysique, et il me semble que c'est la première traduction en français d'un de vos textes, qui a été réalisée par Emmanuel Lévin, et que j'ai édité. Et il semblerait effectivement que toutes ces questions qui étaient vraiment au cœur des débats féministes dans les années 90-2000 jusqu'à en fait aujourd'hui, à travers leur transformation, autour notamment des questions de nature-culture, reviennent, sont revisitées aujourd'hui dans l'espace francophone, mais pas que. Et donc voilà, c'est un honneur de vous recevoir, et encore merci pour votre temps. So now we're going to switch to English. Thank you again so much, and I will leave the floor to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jeanne, for encouraging me to come, and to Patrice Maniglier for the invitation. It's a big deal for an Antipodean to be in this institution. So, yeah, I'm very honoured to be here. Jeanne said she wanted me to really just talk about the arc of my thinking. So this is me just dipping in and out. And mainly it's about the quandaries and the fascinations that really I continue to have. I think I'm still immersed in these questions that I was asking at the beginning. Returning to university in the early 1980s, I was introduced to Saussurean linguistics and the riddle of the language question. The text was the Balian-Séchehay version of the course, an equivocal beginning where Saussure appears through the ventriloquism of his students. And yet this errant introduction seems strangely fitting because how we isolate an origin or entity that will guarantee the proper point of departure for interpretation is the essential problematic that Saussure's work explores, and that its difficulties enact. Saussure apprehends that any beginning must always be provisional, as we are already underway, caught in the vertigo of an infinite regress of other beginnings that both motivate and limit the focus of our attentions. Consequently, a Saussurean approach to things involves a certain messy entanglement. Indeed, referring to the book that he was never to write, Saussure anticipated that the logical presentation of his ideas would be confounded by necessity. And this is the citation here. There is genuinely a necessary absence of any starting point. And if a reader wants to follow my thought carefully from one end of this volume to the other, he will, I am sure, recognise that it was impossible to follow a very rigorous order. I shall take the liberty of placing the same idea before the reader as many as 3 or 4 times, because no one point of departure is more appropriate than another as a foundation for the demonstration. What or where is our starting point if, as Saussure says, in language there are only differences without positive terms? And I sort of want to think slowly about this because this is the stuff that still fascinates me. Because one could ask, differences between what? Importantly, and as the phrasing of this question presumes, the very notion that difference resides in an in-between or an outside of an already existent something, let's assume any sign you might choose, for example, the sign, is not supported in this model or minimally is strangely problematic. How then to acknowledge a more radical understanding of an interiority that includes whatever it is defined against? As a feminist, this is at the time that I went back to university, I already had a career and I went back. As a feminist fascinated by the political agendas seemingly legitimised by the nature-culture body-mind division, I've wondered why and how the body is so naturally feminised, racialised, othered, as comparatively disabled, passive, unthinking, and certainly illiterate. Given the insistence of this politically weighted algorithm, Saussure's reluctance to begin with the conventional stability of a referent, an anchoring hylomorphism or substance, was a welcome provocation. Recall, for example, how Saussure was troubled by the division he makes between signifier and signified, that is, the sense impression, perception, body, and the concept, mind. He was uncomfortable with describing the signifier as the material part of the sign, just as he felt uneasy about their separation. Although diagrams of signifier signified that have conjoining arrows and explanations that note each recalls the other seem to confound his intention to radically implicate, his is not the signifier and signified of Plato's Cratylus, where the conception of the sign installs the signified or idea before the signifier that conjures it. The Saussurean sign granted no elemental priority, no causal direction or primacy to either signifier or signified. They are not independent entities that are then conjoined. Similarly, we tend to think of the sign's identity or value, valeur, as a production effect generated through the economy of other signs. In fact, most people, if they've done work on Saussure, at least people in Australia, they'll say, oh yeah, we know that. It's the arbitrary nature of the sign and you need a context. And that seems to be the end of it. But what are we evoking when we say other signs? Signs that are presumably outside and different from this one, our starting point. I think this is a common reading, namely that the sign's elusive and problematic identity is answered or stabilised by a context, a surround, a difference from, that assumes exactly what is in question. Because to evoke a context or a surround or difference that only an outside can provide and resolve returns us to the same quandary. Isn't this outside and other dependent for its own identifiability on yet another context, another difference, another outside, in an infinite regress or sliding deferral that never arrives? And if valeur works through and as a systematicity of allusion, not illusion, but that sense of again to something else, can we assume that this relentless referral to an outside or elsewhere is finally or ultimately contained or answered by the linguistic system itself, or even a semiology of different systems that together make up a science of the life of science in society, as Saussure said, namely human endeavour, culture? If this is the case, then isn't the foundational hylomorphism of a material and substantive nature made to provide the absent context for semiology to work? As I see it, the implications of Saussurean linguistics compromise and appeal to identity as an isolate and in itself, and therein lies its quite extraordinary provocation. If the signifier, signified sign, and by implication the language system itself is reliant for its operational identifiability or valeur on what appears to be absent, not here, dead, other, not yet, or no longer, then perhaps the tiniest atom of any system might be said to express what we might risk calling a quantum capaciousness. My take on this, I'm going to at least evoke this notion of a superpositional energetics. So what I'm not after, I'm not interested in the slide from one thing to another to another. I think the very notion of the other is already problematic, even if necessary. I don't want that sense of an asymptotic, we almost get there but not quite, a Sisyphean almost. I think I'm trying to think through in the last few years a sort of field theory that presents itself as any unit, any identity you like. Could be sign, signifier, signified, could be the notion of one system. And that's my slide into a sense of a quantum resonance. Let's now consider the referent, that extra-linguistic something that is refused in the Saussurean model. Although the radical intervention of Saussurean linguistics was its challenge to nomenclature, the axiomatics of nomenclature are arguably recuperated in his discussion of signification, which requires some sort of fixity, a referent of sorts, to guarantee the difference, but also the shared commonality on either side of the border. So, of course, he has, mouton, on one side and sheep and mutton on the other. So in a sense, a certain invariance is made to anchor variance here. Also, if we recall, each recalls the other when describing signifier and signified, we also had that sense that there was a difference, that somehow were joined together almost later. But I also want to say, I'm not straightforwardly saying this is a mistake, because if it is, it's inevitable. I don't see it as something that I would want to straightforwardly correct, because for me, the notion of language worlds, translates, produces apparent fixities and differences, insides and outsides. And this is then part of the problematic. My motivation is to include reference or referencing within systematicity or as systematicity, that's the superpositional aspect, to see systematicity at work, as Saussure encourages us to consider, yet without the matter ideation, body-mind segregation, which, despite Saussure's misgivings, become inevitable if systematicity is contained as purely ideational. In other words, these concepts are now under erasure because very much in question. Okay, so while I'm thinking about these things, and I'm back at university, I'm also in anthropology, and one of the things that fascinated me was what's called corridor talk. It often doesn't get written about in an ethnography. It's the stuff that anthropologists might share because it's really weird. So this, there was a student behind me. I did my honours year, and that's after your Bachelor of Arts, you do an honours year, and then you can go on to do graduate work if you want. And there was the student behind me was going to the Philippines to do ethnography on crucifixion rituals. And the really strange thing about it was that if the ritual life is somehow embodied, so that these people tend not to bleed or scar. And that seems to me something in itself, because if we haven't gone through that ritual, one assumes our bodies will behave very differently. But on top of this, this particular student had a nervous breakdown and came back with stigmata. Also around the time I'm sort of fascinated by this, it was the scandal of the Turin Shroud, that it was a fake, that Christ was nailed through the wrist, and that stigmatics, because there are plenty, and apparently the papacy doesn't recognise it as in any way sort of a spiritual state in terms of the Catholic Church. People then started to bleed through the wrist. So this is all going on, and I'm thinking, because I'm interested in the question of the body, what is this, just as a phenomenon? At the same time, of course, feminism, certainly the feminism I'm being taught and wondering about, we're in Charcot's surgery with his analysis of hysteria, and of course Freud is there also, and wondering about what he's seeing. You might have seen those famous, I think it's on the cover of one of the early books, where you have an hysterical woman and just men all around staring. So this is what I'm fascinated by, and at this point I really don't have any explanation for what's going on, but I'm interested. So this is a citation from Georges Didier-Huberman. A patient is hypnotized. The doctor writes his own name on the patient's forearms with a rubber stylet and issues the following suggestion. This evening at 4 p.m. after falling asleep, you will bleed from the lines that I have drawn on your arms. At the appointed time, the patient obliges. The characters appear in bright relief upon his skin, and droplets of blood rise in several spots. The words persist for more than 3 months. So faced with this and thinking about it, I sort of went sideways. Is this an inherent temporality? A spacing in the dermis, an orality? Skin hears the voice. It writes those words with the stylet of its own blood and tissue. It is its own apparatus. An intra-subjective performance. So today you could even say it's also iatrogenesis, which is the relationship between doctor and patient. And the research shows that if you have a doctor that's very positive, you're going to do much better. So it's not as though this just belongs to different periods. There are sort of quotidian aspects to this sort of thing. So this graphomatic structure isn't simply about tactility and connection. It involves the entire sensorium, a synesthesia that challenges the notion that the senses are independently existing aggregates, just as its involvements challenge a conventional sense of what inscription implies, that is, an action upon a passive surface. Now, interestingly, in the citation, it says his, and there were male hysterics, but the really interesting thing was it would appear they were men who had had industrial accidents. So they'd fallen off roofs or had that sort of thing, almost like they were brought up to feel they truly were embodied. And interestingly, Charcot, he assumed that male hysteria was caused by real events, whereas for women it was emotionally induced. So right there you get this split again. You also see it, or I can remember as a young child, people who had come back from the war, and you would get hysterical limps, men who had seen their comrades really blown up, and that they then took on those symptoms. So at this point, I'm thinking of Felix Deutsch and the mysterious leap from the mind to the body, and I'm wondering, is there any link at all? The phenomenon of hysteria, or what today we might call psychosomatic symptoms, somatic compliance, or sociogenic illness, was studied with some intensity in feminist discourse, especially in the 1980s. In fact, just by chance, I finished my honours year, and my first job was in the School of Health and Tropical Medicine, where a particular professor there had received a big grant. And it was to study RSI, repetitive strain injury, which was an especially Australian phenomenon. At that point, people weren't suffering around the world. It was something where people would be in splints on their wrists. It wasn't tennis elbow, it wasn't carpal tunnel. And my job was to go through newspapers and magazines and to decide, was this all in their head or was it real, based on what the reports were saying? And real seemed to be, oh, well, it must be ergonomics. It's the way they're sitting. But the trouble was, it went through the telecommunications industry. And let's say you said, oh, they've got terrible chairs and the relationship with their computers is bad. Over in another industry where they had similarly terrible conditions, they didn't have it, but they could catch it. And so the professor I was working for, who didn't have any of this strange knowledge or question, she just assumed it was a virus because she couldn't see how it could be. It was as though they caught it, but it was line of sight and things they'd read. And so then this became a particularly Australian thing, and it was called kangaroo paw. So they were malingerers, but there were so many of them. It was the biggest compensation cases in our trade union history. And it destroyed, marriages and a whole lot of stuff. So it was really a very big deal. So this is all happening, as I say, at a similar time. And there's a lot of feminist work looking at hysteria. And it was understood to be women were performing these mysterious corporeal contortions which speak of collective stress and anxiety, oppression, political silencing, indeed sexual difference. But regardless of its cause, what intrigued me was wonderfully argued in Elizabeth Wilson's work, where she asked quite simply why feminists who actively argue to acknowledge a corporeal politics seem to be so myopic, excising the very stuff of biology in their analyses. In other words, there was much talk about corporeality, and yet it appeared to be the body as object, not as a subject subjecting itself. In terms of the mind-body division, and assuming there really is such a division, Wilson asks quite simply, how does biology read and perform culture's lesson? I think at this point, every now and then I'm sort of back in it, because how could I not be? I was thinking there was a system of culture, there was a system of nature, and how could they intersect, or how could one, in this case, say cultural values, somehow write on nature? So I still have two, and so I'm thinking basically that culture could write on, affect, or change nature. Nevertheless, I was wondering about nature's receptivity, its compliance, but also its apparent literacy. And then at some point I realised that I didn't need two systems, or at least I was provoked to not talk in terms of two systems, because you're always going to, if you begin with two, you're always wondering about the in-between of them. I decided I could have one, and with a general writing, Derridian notion of general writing, that system is internally differentiated and differentiating. So I decided to rework Derrida's no outside text as no outside nature. So my question has become, what do I forfeit if I do this, and what might I gain? Writing a book on the work of Judith Butler, I was actually really depressed at the time, and I had an opportunity to write a book on Butler's work, and I thought it would be easy because I already knew her work very well. It actually proved incredibly difficult, because you can't just say no to work if you don't like it. You obviously have to elaborate it, and so I think it actually taught me a lot about. It's almost like doing critique. You almost have to love the thing that you want to say no to, but you can't quite. So I'm writing a book on Judith Butler. Where am I here? Oh, sorry, yeah. And I asked her a question, because from my point of view, she had a very narrow understanding of textuality and the discursive, even though I admired various things about her works. So I asked her a question about nature or corporeality, and I think Butler's take is, for me, exemplary of many positions that continue to be held in the humanities. For example, Butler argues that claims to engage the physical world of material things will always be a failed project, because outside the enclosure of human interpretive regimes. According to Butler, humans produce symbolic abstractions about reality, signs that substitute for a real world that exceeds our attempts to capture it. In a remark that I often cite because it succinctly explains what is at stake in this commitment, I refer to an interview I conducted with her. My question is focused on her understanding of language, and if it extends to the code-cracking capacities of bacteria, which constantly morph and mutate as they decipher antibiotic scripts. They actually completely change their ontology. As we know, some bacteria have acquired such sophisticated encryption skills in cracking antibacterial codes that we call them superbugs. When I asked Butler specifically, isn't life creative encryption? Her response is something of an admonition. So she's very much like, no, stop. She says, there are models according to which we might try to understand biology, and models by which we might try to understand how genes function. And in some cases, the models are taken to be inherent to the phenomena that are being explained. I worry that a notion like biological code on the face of it runs the risk of that sort of conflation. I am sure that encryption can be used as a metaphor or model by which to understand biological processes, especially cell reproduction. But do we then make the move to render what is useful as an explanatory model into the ontology of biology itself? This worries me, especially when it is mechanistic models which lay discursive claims on biological life. What if life exceeds the model? When does the discourse claim to become the very life it purports to explain? I am not sure it is possible to say life itself is creative encryption unless we make the mistake of thinking that the model is the ontology of life. Indeed, we might need to think first about the relation of any definition of life to life itself and whether it must, by virtue of its very task, fail. Interestingly, when I asked about how the body could perform hysterical symptoms and read cultural signs, she noted that there is a nature outside the sign nature. So there's, if you like, culture back projects and produces a notion of nature, but somehow that's not the real nature, and so there is another nature. And this is one that is not immediately harnessed for the aims of certain kinds of cultural legitimation practices. Now, for me, that's important because it also implies that, because I'm trying to expand this notion of a field and calling it nature, that politics is cultural. So nature can't be political inherently. Power is to do with humans, and any sense of power. Power is also about domination. There's no sense of the strategic, the capillary, all those sorts of things. So in a way, nature is again feminized, made passive, largely benign. In fact, it's almost always benign, linked with harmony, indigeneity, and so on. So in quantum anthropologies, one of the things I took up because I thought it might be a good illustration, at least for me, it's just so fascinating, and that is forensic facial reconstruction. Arguably a semiology, more accurately, perhaps a grammatology that complicates how we understand the difference between matter and ideation as interactive. So if you take these plugs, and you might have seen in TV shows, they put these little plugs on 28 to 32 places on a skull. So they would guard a skull as sort of a global object. And they might find a skull and they don't know, is it 150 years old? Is it 18 months old? And so in order to give this skull a face, and I just find this so incredibly fascinating, they put these plugs there. And so in a way, every one plug, because you'd sort of think, well, maybe this plug is going to tell me about how much flesh I need to put on in that one place. But actually, any one part of this global algorithm is absolutely, completely tuned into every other plug. Even to the extent that where a reasonable part of the face is missing, they can often conjecture, it's a sort of critical mass thing, what maybe the front of the face was like because of the plugs they still have. So in other words, any one plug is all plugs. Okay, so how much flesh are they going to put on? And we see this with the clay there. And this, to me, is where it just gets so amazingly, what for me is the absolute fascinations of semiology. They put that flesh on because what they consult is not just the specific algorithm that every one of us has in the head, but they have data from the faces of the dead, apparently, which is maybe it's another thing to research, but in morgues around the world, pins are being stuck in faces and measurements taken. And to get those final measurements about how much flesh to put on any one of those little nodes, it's through the faces of the dead that the numbers come up. And by implication, it's also the faces of the unborn. So in a way, any particular face is given by a general faciality of humanness. And so in the end, you end up with let's say, the guy on the end, and amazingly, people can recognise a person from that, but they have to know them. It was just a matter, have you ever seen this person? It has to be someone who was in your orbit that you came to know. So this illustrates how the specificity of any identity is spoken by a generality. Specificity is not the other of generality. One system is not straightforwardly autonomous and self-defined, even if it looks that way. And as regards a rethinking of science, because there is something implied here, obviously if you're opening up the question of nature, I think the question of science is in there. What to do with the subject-object split? And this is actually something that you said. Writing cannot simply be the object of science, since it is also the condition of science itself. Now, you may have been talking about a different understanding of writing, but I'm sort of generalising it in a Derridian way, where I already am all of the things that I'm going to look at. I'm already made up of that. So in this way of thinking, we are no longer caught in cultural solipsism, or what defines the human as identifiably exceptional. Nature here is not mediated or even identifiably separated from human forms of cognitive analysis. Again, I go back to my superpositional energetics, and another way I've tried to think it is as hologrammatic. Karen Barad tells me she's not sure it works absolutely, so it's research I have to do, but at least for our purposes. You probably know with a hologram, you can move yourself and look around the image. And the idea is that, also hologram means whole writing, that if you broke the hologram into pieces and you picked up a piece, and let's say it was the piece that had been my hand, all of me would be there again, but from a particular perspective. So it just at least evokes for me one way of thinking this. So I just want to go to two things, especially read against Butler's "you can't get there, you'll never get there." And it is that sense there are two systems and you're trying to get across a gulf. So this is Karen Barad. Rather blasphemously, agential realism denies the suggestion that our access to the world is mediated, whether by consciousness, experience, language, or any other alleged medium. Rather, like the special theory of relativity, agential realism calls into question the presumption that a medium, an ether, is even necessary. And this is Derrida in, I think this was actually, I don't think this is straight out of Life, Death. This was the early manuscripts that I was looking at. But to me, I'm completely wowed by this. This is where Derrida is talking about Francois Jacob and his work on RNA. And Jacob was quite exercised by what he was looking at. What was the nature of this language? He was in consultation with Jacobson, and there was, they were obviously really concerned with what was it. And at the time, although this was some years ago when I was tracking it, they just decide it can't be like, if you like, let's call it a natural language or a cultural language. They just decided it, but without actually explaining that decision. And so this is Derrida's response as he moves through that material. That which we men claim to accept in culture as model, that is to say, discursive texts or calculators and all that we believe to understand familiarly under the name of text. That which we pretend then to accept as model, comparison, analogy, with a view of understanding the basic living entity, this itself is a complex product of life, of the living, and the claimed model is exterior neither to the knowing subject nor to the known object. The text is not a third term in the relation between the biologist and the living. It is the very structure of the living as shared structure of the biologist, as living, of science as production of life, and the living itself. I just find that citation incredibly provocative. So what happens if we want to explore this way of thinking and reading? What sort of provocations does it raise? And it seems to me that everything changes. We're confronted with questions that refuse the familiar grammar of oppositional identities and adjudications, even though they do and must reappear. So it's not as though all of that gets wiped out, of course. One implication is how we understand human exceptionalism and contemporary arguments about the Anthropocene, whereby man becomes author and responsible agent of planetary welfare. So before, when I was thinking about these questions, it was the male-female question. But as more recently, obviously, with what's happening in terms of planetary welfare and the movement to talk about the Anthropocene, I just feel that the question is the same, it's just being enlarged. I'm just missing something. Oh, here. But what I'm going to do is just read something from a piece I've written about where I'm sort of elaborating this question a little bit, and it's where I suggest this notion of originary humanicity. In Of Grammatology, Derrida takes us into the jungles of Brazil to revisit a scene of first contact, reported by Claude Lévi-Strauss in Tres Tropiques. Indigenous peoples have been given an important role in this story, which unsurprisingly runs to the very same script that is now under investigation. The Nambikwara appear comparatively puerile, their attentions focused on the trinkets that the anthropologist has bought for them in the hope of buying their cooperation. However, Lévi-Strauss's own interest is very much elsewhere. The backdrop to the drama is the laying of a telegraph line by a band of labourers, and the fascination is the inevitable sense of ambush that these unsuspecting, illiterate, I think he's done something to the pages, illiterate people are about to experience as their world has changed forever. There is something prurient about watching this encounter through Lévi-Strauss's eyes, especially when the tribal chief, quote, the only one among them to have understood what writing was for, end quote, mimes the act of reading from a scrap of paper to impress his followers. For Lévi-Strauss, the act is empty yet portentous, because the posturing affectation and self-importance are testament to their opposite, the pathos of a primitive society's inevitable demise at the hands of an encroaching and superior technology. Although Lévi-Strauss appears forthright in acknowledging his part in this, Derrida reads the anthropologist's mea culpa as self-deception. Derrida says, one already suspects, and all Lévi-Strauss's writings would confirm it, that the critique of ethnocentrism, a theme so dear to the author of Tres Tropiques, has most often the sole function of constituting the other as a model of original and natural goodness, of accusing and humiliating oneself, of exhibiting its being unacceptable in an anti-ethnocentric mirror. Derrida reads Levi-Strauss's self-identification as guilty author of the other's demise as an ethnocentrism thinking itself as anti-ethnocentrism, an ethnocentrism in the consciousness of a liberating progressivism. And that strikes me as particularly pertinent at the moment, because anyone who's reading about the Anthropocene, there is constant breastfeeding about the horror, the guilt, that this is the Anthropocene, we are so responsible. And then in the next breath, it seems to be, thank God we can fix this. So there's a question of agency in the first instance that is recuperated in the second, as though this would just go on. We were bad then, but now we'll be good. And the assumption in the first remains that it is the human that has that power and that agency to either do well or not. I want to use this reading as a provocation for our current question about anthropocentrism, human exceptionalism, and ecology as grammatology. I will stick to only certain aspects of this story that directly relate to the issue at hand. First, how ethnocentrism, here anthropocentrism, is reaffirmed in the self-deprecating act of admitting guilt and insisting that humans are the change agents of environmental degradation or salvation. And second, how a particular contestation of anthropocentrism or human exceptionalism might effectively reroute these conventional terms of exchange and leave us with something much less predictable to think with. For Derrida, the identity of writing, even in the restricted sense of the term, is not clear-cut. He says, actually, the people said to be without writing lack only a certain type of writing. Derrida is alert to the ways in which we, quote, refuse the name of writing to this or that technique of consignment, end of quote. And we see this when Levi-Strauss describes the Nambiquara's efforts as mere imitation, quote, without understanding its meaning or its end. They call the act of writing, it's a very strange word, namely drawing lines. What is important in Derrida's response is its relevance for our discussion of anthropocentrism, given that the special capacities that explain human exceptionalism are leveraged against an other, nature, the ecology, that is similarly illiterate, uncomprehending, only capable of imitating cognition. And we get this all the time, where just recently in New Scientist, you might have read about ants that were amputating legs, the legs of other ants, legs that were wounded. They do a control, and they find that for whatever reason, the ants that are practicing amputations are very successful in 90% of cases. And at the end, the researcher says that they don't know what they're doing. And so it's like a science wants to say, don't worry, it's just a program. So I'm not saying they know what they're doing, but I'm not sure we know what we're doing. So it's just want to open those sort of questions. Derrida asks why drawing lines is an inadequate description of writing. He says, it is as if one said that such a language has no word designating writing, and that therefore those who practice it do not know how to write, just because they use a word meaning to scratch, to engrave, to scribble, to scrape, to incise, to trace, to imprint. As if to write in its metaphoric kernel meant something else. It is not ethnocentrism. Is not ethnocentrism always betrayed by the haste with which it is satisfied by certain translations or certain domestic equivalents? By way of simple analogy with respect to the mechanisms of ethnocentric assimilation or exclusion, let us recall with Renan that in the most ancient languages, the words used to designate foreign people are drawn from two sources, either words that signify to stammer, to mumble, or words that signify mute. Given this legacy similarity with our representation of nature as mute, or babbling without purpose, waiting to be represented, perhaps we might ask why the myriad patternments of fitness, the shape-shifting morphologies of exquisite ecological adaptation, are not forms of writing. Why are they not rememorations? Indeed, why should they not be counted as deliberations? Derrida notes that when we perceive complexity in nature, he says, the notion of program is invoked to secure its difference from what we are and what we do. Such protective gestures explain nature's apparent societal complexity, swarming behaviours, and cooperative strategies in terms of unthinking algorithms, whereas human exceptionalism is considered exceptional because irreducible to these primitive roots that precede culture. It is a program or algorithm without internal differentiation and inventiveness, given Derrida's notion of originary difference, where writing is imprinting, tracing, grafting, moving. We could retrieve human exceptionalism as it is routinely understood by conceding that we are a part of nature, a unique part. However, grammatology or difference mangles this understanding of difference as metonymic, the aggregation of identifiable differences that somehow sit together. When the voice of radical exteriority, here the ecology or environment, speaks as human exceptionalism, then its adaptive possibilities remain open, myriad, negotiable, murderous, positive, negative, fraught. Further, the sense of exceptionalism as a quality or capacity among others is instead dispersed and morphologically mutable. We could even say that originary writing manifests as a sort of originary humanicity, a specificity of decisive adaptation whose ubiquity is ecological change. However, I suspect my imagined reader will complain that the life of such an ecology could prove indiscriminate in its judgments, even perceiving death and destruction as fascinating opportunities to explore what might be, even what should be. Within this particular scene of ecological vitality, which is in no way alien to being human, the opposition between life and death collapses in the very act of ecological genesis. And with no absolute limits, for all limits are grammatologically entangled, every decision is a systemic adaptation. Every author authored by the ecology at large. Importantly, however, this needn't mean that nature or the ecology is a prescriptive adaptation, as the term program might imply. Natural selection is a messy yet exquisitely intricate and poetic business because fitness is a general manufacture, a general writing. If all of life's protagonists, even those who appear murderously opposed, are ecologically bound within each other, and if the outcomes that we seek, however different, are rooted in life's own will to self-understanding and reinvention, then how should we proceed? Derrida's contribution to questions about ethics is to favour creative invention over partisan political compliance. However, Geoffrey Bennington captures the glum frustration that we might feel when a call to act, especially one that feels urgent, remains open-ended, even its terms unresolved. Bennington says, Derrida's regular appeals to the need for invention in the fields of ethics or politics necessarily disappoint. We would obviously like to be told what to invent, at which point we would be released from the responsibility of invention. I have argued that a decision is inherently ecological because it is made in relation, not because we are in a relation with the ecology, the object of a decision, the thing about which a decision is made, but because the ecology is the subject the who that decides. Bennington is again helpful here. He says, if we are to talk intelligibly of decisions and responsibilities, then we must recognise that they take place through the other, and that their taking place in me tells us something about the other already in me, such that, following another axiom of deconstructive thought, I am only insofar as I already harbour, welcome the other in me. Although deconstruction offers no program for change, it does shift the terms of political contestation. If anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism are not one perspective, if the alien is not outside, then who are we and how might we learn to be at home with difference? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this really thought-provoking ending, how to be at home with difference. Alors, I'm gonna start with perhaps one question, and then I will leave the floor. And it's a question that I ask myself and that I ask other. So it's not specific to your talk, but I'm just curious to hear your response to that. And in the sense that it's a question that one, such as, for example, Judith Butler would object, and perhaps that's something that they may be worried about, is how do we integrate the history of science as part of so you were, for example, quoting and referring to scientific research, whether it is on genetics, like as a code, on ants, on forensic archaeology, and offering to engage with scientific research, taking seriously their knowledge as also a source of thinking and telling us things about about what we call nature or reality, and not something that we have always to be, oh, I cannot say anything about that, right? But yeah, how first not to céder, not to fall into the trap of positivism or scientism, you know, and some sort of like a naive scientificism, and for that, how do we also integrate in the way we engage with science their own historicity and cultural context and social context?
These are big questions. I don't have any blueprint for what people should do, and I think the difficult aspect of what I'm arguing is that the most naive positivism and empiricism still does things. And that's part of what I'm interested to explore. So if you don't see them as simply failed models, which I'm trying to open that up, if you see that life as such models itself well, poorly, it's not simply that we humans have models that have nothing to do with the world, but it's in the nature of worlding that, and that's why I want to sort of turn this into almost a subject of sorts, that all things are possible, and that out of that then you make a choice. So personally, I've been working on with a group called Phytological Critique, which is working on plants for the last 3 years, and it just came to a close at the University of Chicago. And part of that was talking to scientists, but you're obviously looking for people in any field that you can share some I suppose, openness about how things work. So somebody like Monica Galliano was, she worked in marine science, and she just got completely turned off. She lives in Australia, but apparently, I didn't know this, but you have to kill all the little fish she's been working with a school of fish, and at the end of her study, she has to kill them all. I don't know if there are any scientists here, but maybe you have to prove they didn't have weird growths and that's why they behaved the way they did. In other words, they were healthy. And she goes down the day before, she's saying goodbye. So she's on the barrier reef and she's just with them, except she's not with them because they're all hiding. And she just thought, so the next day she has to go and she has to actually catch them and kill them. And she thought that's the end of it. And so she turned to plants. And she decided she would research plants and she would treat them like animals, with all of the assumptions you would apply to an animal, and they behaved accordingly. So, for example, I thought plants that their roots were in moisture and that they could sort of feel it, and so then they went in that direction. No, they hear it. They can hear the sound of water through a certain range of decibels. Once you get into some of this stuff, you just think, like, what is going on with some of these creatures? And I'm sure you all know now that plants have language. I'm just going to use that expression. I'm not crazy about it. They have volatile organic compounds, and so they're sending off little gases that are saying things to other plants, to insects, and people call it a plant language. And you have to wonder, why do they call it a plant language? Because they're also, if you like, speaking to insects and all manner of creatures, creatures in the soil, in the air. And what strikes me as interesting is that we humans have 1,400 volatile organic compounds that we release. And so what are we doing that we don't even know we're doing? And also we were working at Oxford with a sleep scientist. So I think there are all sorts of really interesting ways, if you're with scientists who actually want to open up their the grounds of what they're doing, and I think they're out there. So this is a guy who's been working on sleep, and I said, you know, well, what's been happening lately in the sleep area? And he said almost nothing. He said, we didn't even know. When you're awake, apparently half your brain is asleep. When you're asleep, half your brain is awake. And so he had a continuum. This would be sleep and this would be awake. And I said, but isn't that just an heuristic? You're not really sure what the difference is. And that seems really bizarre to me, but you will get scientists who just want to really open up everything. So personally, I want to work with them. I think they're out there. But in a way, I'm also saying that I think in the humanities, we have to redefine science, because surely the things we argue also change things. But that's why I showed you the stuff on hysteria. If you can have, like we've obviously got the placebo effect and the nocebo effect, even if you know a drug, it's not going to do anything because it's a placebo, you're still going to respond. All those sorts of things. I think we have a lot to add to the discourse of science, but I think we also need to rethink exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. Because if the assumption is I'm going to look at this object which has nothing to do with me, I think we can further complicate that, and obviously there are aspects of the sciences that are doing
that. I don't know if anyone wants to react to that, or yes.
I am. First, I would like, maybe you can switch off because it creates. No, just the TV, John. You can switch off the TV maybe simply because it's better for you. So first, I would like to thank you, to thank you for what you've done for us, and which is going through your work, starting from Saussure, arriving to ants and plants, and showing how a particular version of structuralism or post-structuralism could reframe questions we are asking ourselves today, in particular about ecology, in such a powerful way. So I really want to thank you. And Jeanne was saying that your work is a kind of convergence point for many of the questions we've been asking here for many years. And I think today you showed that is very true. I mean, you can't even imagine how true it is, because we've been asking some of the questions you were passing through for different sessions, including Butler, Karen Barra, the question of superposition, and so on. So really, thank you. And indeed, maybe following up on what Jeanne said, you still end up, and so this is not at all an objection from me, but you still end up with this notion of text, or this notion of writing. We might even say this notion of value in a certain way, it's a certain idea of Saussurean value, as a most useful metaphor to prevent us from falling into the dualisms, basically, that prevent us from working together with scientists and between humanities and scientists. So there is still something of a privilege, you might say, of a particular concept, which seems better to designate something which is basically immanent, we should say, in the Deleuzian sense, or substance. Spinoza probably would say substance is text, or substance is sign, or substance is value, or something like that. And that, I think, is so you accept, basically, so this is producing a kind of philosophy, which is a very modest form of philosophy, right? Because in a way you say it's a metaphor. And indeed, I was struck by what Judith Butler answered to you, as if there was something else than metaphors in language. Because when she was saying, this is a metaphor, but we should not be fooled by metaphors. It's saying, as if language was not made of metaphors. So text is a metaphor, I suppose, but it's a particular kind of metaphor, which is at the moment where we stand now, maybe in history, and what Jeanne said, history, is the most useful one from an ontological point of view.
Certainly the question of value, and I think of, that's, I think, why I fell in love with Saussure, because it was this systematicity where, as Gayatri Spivak calls value in Marxism, that small contentless thing. So you've got something that's like nothing, and yet you sort of have everything. And so it raises so many questions, and that's where I definitely like to start there. In terms of textuality, this reminds me of the Catherine Mellon. I'm not comfortable with the idea that it's a metaphor, because obviously metaphor implies it's a way of understanding something else. It seems to me it does. If I say life metaphorizes, it's in the nature of life to constantly be changing. I can go with that. But when I say that, I do mean meat. I'm not talking about meat. I'm saying right now, the meat of me directly engages you. And I think most of the time, like, people will tend to say to me, because I've done a lot of talking, especially in the last year, they'll say, but isn't that just a metaphor? It's usually just. Well, you're not really saying, are you? Like, that would make you mad. So for me, language it's not an instrument. As Derrida says, it's not a third term in between. It is, so I'm happy to say there's no outside language, but obviously you would have to change or elaborate what one's understanding is when we say language. And I think Derrida constantly said, by textuality, I don't mean what's inside the covers of a book. He said this, and yet I go to Derrida today, and most of the time, in my experience, most Derridians there are talking about human culture. And even with the stuff I've done on plants recently, you still have a human that's intact. It's a coherent subject that might lend its special abilities with language to a plant a little bit. Or maybe ants, maybe they write in formic acid, but it couldn't be very complex. And so you sort of get this containment even as you give the gift to these other creatures and so on. And so in terms of this superpositional thing, I would want to say if it's a field theory, I have to say the field specifies. It's not as though I don't want to have, well, here's a person and there's a leaf and over there is something else. In a way, yes, but in another sense, it's like the texture of fielding specifies, articulates, speaks me. So I'm trying to get that up. If that,
yes,
in the same way that you could say long, okay, everybody has a particular mother tongue, and yet we all have an idiolect, and yet we're of a commons. I want that sense of a particularity, but I don't want to lose. I don't want to lose that the signature, the personal signature, the specificity is, if you like, written or articulated through a commons.
But in the notion of metaphor, there is indeed this notion of becoming other, and it's only a matter of saying that being is itself metaphorizing. In the sense you say metaphorizing, if you want, it's like meat. Yes. But it so happens that metaphor is for us, or the ontologization of metaphor is for us now. A good tactical or strategic or a good metaphorical.
It could be, but if you're speaking to an audience and they're all saying, "But isn't this just a metaphor?" You're going to have to do more work because they want to find a way not to complicate the human. The human has to be the subject, and it has a context around it that is not human. And so even when you find evidence of, let's call it, smarts, cognition, all manner of bizarre things, somehow it's belittled. And my interest has always been in the as a feminist question, why that always occurs. Where the body or nature is somehow sort of denigrated or simplified or made primitive, and so I want to muck that around.
But it seems to me that what you're also doing, I mean, as a way to answer to my own questions that I was asking you, and also following up on Patrice's question, is also a sort of strategy in the sense that it's a way, how can I say that? It's not so much, for example, taking research scientific research as like some sort of truth, universal truth or eternal truth, but it's how this can unsettle us and how can it also reopens questions without finding necessarily answers, and always and so textuality in that sense, or it's where am I going with that? What I want to try to underline is how it's a sort of ethics itself to every time that a question seems to close itself, to open up this question again by kind of, taking what we thought was the cause as the effect, by taking what's the origin as actually the end point. And this always kind of healthy intellectual gesture to destabilize categories and yes, opening difference always in that case. So it seems that it's a kind of a no, it doesn't make quite sense what I'm trying to say.
I think so. It's a processual, like it's not something where you straightforwardly know where you're going. It's where the way it feels to me is I'm being pushed and locked in certain ways, and I want to say, well, hang on, what about that? I want to open that up, and then maybe if I go that way, it's going to happen again. But I've always wanted to ask, in terms of a corporeal politics, how the body as such is a field of language. Like we have something wrong with us, we go and have all these tests done, and what is that? It isn't reading the very stuff of us. And so I don't know what it means to say humans have language, but somehow the meat of me doesn't. So I want to say I am language. It's in the nature of nature to be language. And so then you, of course, it's, the only reason I wouldn't focus on it when I'm speaking in that way is, as I say, people will say, but that's just a metaphor.
Sure.
The same as
does. What is very impressive, I think, in your move is that you show that semiotics or semiology, because I'm a Saussurean, so I prefer semiology, which has been taken as a form of dualistic thinking, nature-culture divide, is in fact maybe one of the best tools in town to have a post-dualistic way of thinking. And that I found very impressive. And if you add to that the fact that it is the self-deconstructive movement that is inside Saussurean semiology itself that ends up giving us the tools for going beyond this dualistic thinking, which actually prevents us from thinking as far as we could think now. That makes it even more, I think, impressive and instructive, because in a time where we tend to oppose the semiotic tradition, in particular the structuralist and post-structuralist tradition, to the ontologization or re-ontologization of the intellectual move, in particular in anthropology, but not only. You move, it's very important, I think, because precisely it shows that the semiological approach is actually maybe the best in town. And of course, only if indeed we accept that language is by itself and originally metaphorical. So, and that's the Saussurean position.
Yes, and as I say, when I first read Saussure, and it's a strange thing where probably everyone here has that proper name, where something happens and you read that person and they just, somehow they get into your heart, and then that's what drives you. And so when I was reading Saussure, I was all those questions, and even the apparent mistakes to me are really crucial. I don't want them cleaned up. I want to, really think them through. And obviously the question of the arbitrary. That was, I actually had Liz Gross as she was teaching me. As I say, I was a student because I already had a career. I went back. And I was in, I found it very intimidating. It was like the cognoscenti of Sidney were there, maybe like 60 people at night at 9:15 in winter. And I thought everyone was so smart, I couldn't speak. And then I asked this question. And as I asked it, I answered it and I said, oh, you'd say it's arbitrary, wouldn't you? And she said, yes. And that was a complete epiphany, because my then partner, I slipped a piece of paper across and I said, I'm in, and she's wrong. So I was, and then that's what motivated me to start writing in Telling Flesh. It was just too easy. You're thinking systematicity, you have a notion of the arbitrary without any, well, what is systematicity if it's all chance? I don't know what a system is. And so then you've got all those questions that have never left me. I'm still, churning away at those things. But it's really, the question of structuralism and the internal dynamics and play of structuration, which you might call it a metaphorics, but all of that.
Okay, now I have a more technical question, which is about the notion of substance, and in a structuralist sense, indeed, in the Saussurean and also Jemslevian sense, because you referred to the notion of reference.
Yes.
But as you know, there is also this couple of substances and form. So the system is a form, according to Saussure, but it's made of substances, both phonetic substance and what he calls psychological substance, which of course is a very bad word for that. Isn't there in this notion of substance something that could actually do some of the work you would like to be done?
I'd say sure. It's just that I've moved on to do this. I was doing that work a long time ago, so I want to question the form substance, the way that tends to run. And I think we're in difficult times because you sort of have to anticipate an audience and start to tailor an argument in terms of those expectations. And I wonder if you, because I would like to just, do the work, and you're saying you just want to be alone doing the work. It's almost like, at least for me, I've just been at the University of Chicago and I'm normally in Sydney. I think something's happened where people don't want to hear that. I feel 20 years ago, people were doing it. I don't know if it's just nostalgia, but now increasingly there seems to be big questions, moral questions, and you should have answers. And I'm finding it debilitating. I don't know if it's just me, but so I don't know, like that sort of work, then you might be in a tiny group of linguists. How much can you do that work and speak to a general audience? That's the trouble.
Yeah, but I mean, when we think of what is the outside of language, which is still within language, of course, one immediate thing that we think of is reference.
Yeah.
But there is something else, which is what substances, the materials of which languages are made of, and I think I think the notion of substance has been a little undermined in the structuralist tradition, maybe in particular in the philosophical approach, where the question of reference has taken over this idea that, well, language is made of something which is not linguistic, like the sounds, the sound substance is both in and not in the phonological structure, but it's not completely out. For instance, when people speak of naturalization, the relation of typically arbitrariness, whether languages are arbitrary or not arbitrary. Well, one aspect of the answer to the question is, well, they are they're based on substances, so they cannot be anything given the substances they are made of. So if they are made of sounds that can be uttered by a human vocal organ, well, there need to be some kind of constraints. So it's a different way of approaching the relation between language and its outside.
You could go there. I mean, there's myriad ways you can go. There's not just one. In fact, in Telling Flesh, I was really interested in the notion of hearing, because there's a percussionist, Evelyn Glennie, who's profoundly deaf. She went deaf at 12. I think they didn't realise she'd gone deaf, and they were asking, like, what do you want to be? And she said a percussionist, and then they were realising she was deaf, and it made no sense. But she is a percussionist, and she hears certain sounds with her jaw. She doesn't wear shoes, so her entire body is a tympanum, like an ear. So those sorts of things, I like to go sideways because it's not straightforward what the substance is in terms of how it works and so on. So I'd also like to.
Je peux aussi traduire en anglais si vous avez des questions.
So I have another remark, since nobody's taken advantage of this silence, and which is about the notion of resemblance. Because when you mentioned the passage in Lévi-Strauss, well, it's Derrida, grammatology on Lévi-Strauss, and la leçon d'écriture, the Nambiquara. And it was indeed a very striking passage that you mentioned from Derrida. Why not saying it's writing? Why saying it's drawing? And I think what is behind some of the things you said is also the power, which sometimes have been undermined again in the structuralist tradition, of resemblance. So it resembles. Resemblance is a very beautiful thing, because there's something which is the same and different. So in the notion of resemblance, you have something of that. Basically, the mimesis is maybe more powerful than I don't know if you've done some work on this notion of mimesis, which has been so important also in the history of philosophy of biology and so on.
I'm quite fascinated by Roger Caillois's work because he basically says anthropomorphism all the way down. Even you crack open a stone and you see these paintings, and he says, "Who is it for?" I just like the way he just messes it all up. But you might know in Lacan's The Mirror Stage, where he mentions the mimesis. I think it's moths on a tree, or he refers to Caillois, who does that. And there's always that question about how does a moth know what the tree looks like in order to look like a tree? All of those things I think are fantastic. Basically, I think it's Caillois who answers, like, why do they do that? And he says, because they can, because they love it. They're just metaphorizing. So there's heaps of stuff you could go in those directions that I think would be quite artistically provocative around resemblance and mimicry and so on. Yeah, quite.
And resemblance is also at the heart of anthropology, and because it's at the heart of comparison. So it looks like writing, but it's not writing. So there is not, might be understood not in a strong negative sense, but in the sense of putting forward difference rather than. Yeah, exactly. That's not reducing it to the same.
Sure, of course.
And, opening it up to its own internal difference, which, as you beautifully said, which comes back on us. We don't know what, we're not sure we mean something, or we speak, or that we know what we're doing. And so it's resemblance coming back on it. So it's a very, I think, anthropological way of thinking. Reclaiming the opacity of the subject of knowledge within the act of knowledge itself. I think is also another way of seeing it. And now I have a question about the mask. Yeah, I wasn't sure I understood exactly what those masks were made for and how they functioned. So,
you mean the head,
the forensic
face.
Yeah.
So that's an archaeology?
That's in forensics, that people are doing that all the time. Probably they're now using computing differently, but they're still running algorithms.
Yeah.
That's it. How does your face look the way it does? How do they know? Because they consult faciality.
But isn't that made, but here it seems like it's on a probabilistic, it's based on statistics and probability, which seems for me another way of, it's not quite the same as the question of systematicity and difference in textuality or language. Like what was really interesting, it's when you said that each nodal, or
each node in a way has all of those nodes talking to one. So it's also just that thing here is what's going to make how much flesh they're going to put on.
Yes,
they're consulting every other. This contains within it information right around your skull, and then it contains information from faciality. Of the unborn, it's like human faciality, a very particular face is a field of faces.
When you're saying that they are speaking of the other nodes, or speaking to the other nodes, you mean that it's like in a neural network? Is that what you're mentioning? Is that what you're
actually, maybe that's a way to think about it. But they've found people where quite a bit of the face that you're going to look at and say, yes, there's face, is gone. And so what they can extrapolate is things to do with the shape of the skull, the thickness of the skull will talk to the front of the face. So it's like any little bit you come in on, that's why I was saying holographic, it's got within it a generality.
Okay.
And it's not just the generality of your particular face. Your particular face is the generality of faciality as you.
Okay. So it's the reconstitution of the whole of the face from a particular piece that has been that has survived, and which enables you to say it's because this particular piece is actually in sort of communication with
And so in a way, you could also say, you know, because there's stuff, mathematics is internal to natural languages, to bone, to so it gives you another way to start to get that cacophony of things.
But why were you saying that the last face shown on the slide could be someone we know, and that it depends on? I didn't quite get that, because I thought it meant that it was producing a generic face that is kind of...
No, it's producing a particular face.
Of someone who died and we found the skull.
Yeah, and like, oh, so this is what they look at. What is really fascinating, because I assumed it was the artist who was putting the flesh on and they just got a feel for that skull. But really, they're doing all this mathematical stuff. But they still do that because there's stuff written up where whoever is doing it somehow puts their own face in it. So it's got all these resemblances and resonances. But what you're getting is a particular face from a general field of faces. So it applies to your skull, but also to a field of skulls.
It's a very structural approach to faces, indeed,
well,
where a face is just an actualization of a virtual.
Well, that's right. And look, you could, I mean, I can't, but obviously if you were getting into, you know, Darwin and all those sorts of things, because Darwin, again, in terms of the entity, he doesn't have a species. He has speciation. He has this thing happening, which of course is any one species is entangled with all species. But I think that would be, I mean, there'd be questions there about faciality as such. So you could think about other creatures and animals and the question of the face and the what and where of it, you know, like you can keep going.
I can continue. I don't want to occupy. But okay, I'm just going to make a last one, maybe about decision, because I mean, again, as I said, you said so many things that sort of encountered things we've said throughout this seminar. That's why I have a lot of things I would like to get back to. But that, yeah, what you said about decision too was very impressive for me, because so in this seminar we studied Karen Barrett's text, and actually I also studied, or I also tried to propose, or I showed really that Lévi-Strauss' structural anthropology was understood by him as using the philosophy of quantum mechanics from a friend of his, whose name was Pierre. And basically he says something like that. He says, so this Pierre creates the concept of the absolute object, which is the particle. So the particle is absolute, and the observations are only partial actualizations of this absolute object. But of course, through statistic methods, we can actually understand that the particle is the superposition of those various actually incompatible states. And what Lévi-Strauss then says that the sensible world, experience, basically, the empirical world, makes sense because there is a kind of subjective element expressing itself through experiences, because particles make decisions. And the category of decision which is used there, that is, each time there is an observation, a decision is being made. It's being made by the particle, but not only. It's also an encounter between two absolute objects, or two real entities, or two monads, in fact, you could say. So, and you said it, I think. Well, I would like to know whether you would agree on that interpretation of what you said, because you said that decision is, and again, you used Bennington and Derrida on that, decision is the expression of an encounter, which is an extraordinary subversion of the concept of decision, which is for us linked to the notion of sovereignty and so on. But there it's linked to the notion of encounter. Yeah. So would you elaborate on that?
I can go with that. The complexity is that in a way, yes, to encounter. Actually, I'd like to know what the etymology is. I'm always interested in how those things work. But it can't be an encounter straightforwardly between two separate entities that pre-exist the encounter. So it's both an encounter of sorts and a rememorization, because in a way they, I mean, I don't know, the language fails me. They already know each other, and yet, and then they encounter each other. Something that comes back to inseparability, where separability and inseparability are not oppositional, but it's like you need the sense of separation, but you also want a sense of entanglement. So it would be about working with that apparent contradiction that sort of isn't. That's the.
Yeah, we need to think that there is more. We need to go beyond a certain form of relational ontology that would say that things don't exist in themselves, they only exist in their relations, in a way. We need to say, well, in fact, you can only say that because there is more for each of them than what is given in the relation. So it's a notion of external relation. The relation is not internal, otherwise you would be able to sort of fold into the entity all the relations it could have. But as you said, also, you don't want to say that they are completely, that the encounter is just a meeting halfway.
Yeah, I don't want to say that they exist, that they pre-exist the encounter. By the same token, I want to have the sense of an encounter.
Exactly.
And that's the dilemma. Or
and
the fascination.
One way to say it is to say that there could be another encounter.
Exactly, it's because the kind of separability or otherness that remains within entity is that because there are other possible encounters. And that is being contained by the element. That's why the element is not reducible to how it's been determined by this specific encounter. There's always something more.
There's always something more, and to turn it into something more that's more, it makes it's easier. It seems to me that, and in fact, I was talking about this to you because I was teaching forensics, so I was fascinated that in the courts, a jury, the thing that a jury trusts more than anything else is the eyewitness. And the eyewitness is the most unreliable, not because they're lying or that they're just making things up, although that might happen. But in good faith, our memories are made up of other people's memories, bits of movies, who knows? And we knew that from post-structural stuff around subjectivity. So that you can, how you, let's say when you're writing something, you think, hey, this is pretty good, and you go away and have a coffee, you come back and you think, actually, this is pretty bad. I mean, all that stuff where you're encountering yourself, there's myriad possibilities in what might be the one text, or you meet a friend, you have a really good time, and then later you think about it, you think, actually, and you decide there was something really wrong, and all that sort of thing where nothing sits there in a stable way. So it doesn't mean that you're not encountering them, but of course, all those possibilities, some of them you might see because you experience that you change your mind, but others are all inside that decision in the first instance. So the decision isn't simply one thing decides, it's like a potentiality that realizes in a way, but it never sits still. So then later it might morph and turn into something else. In fact, that's life.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question about Deleuze.
No, I don't.
You don't answer questions about Deleuze. Yeah, where is Deleuze somewhere there in your?
No, it's really interesting because I did a class with Paul Patton on Deleuze. Admittedly, I was working all day. I was exhausted. I was, I've tried reading Deleuze. And my partner is a Deleuzian.
Except what he says, I think, yes. But when I'm hearing other Deleuzians give papers and things, I just think I just can't go with this. So I think I have to assume I'm just not I'm not well read enough. So I'm not critical with any knowledge base. Like let's say the notion of an assemblage, automatically as a Derridian, it sounds to me like it's a bunch of stuff. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Okay, I've got 6 over here. Well, that's not going to work for me. And the way that the rhizomatic becomes somehow morally yes, and something on molar becomes horrible, I can't do anything with that either. So I'm sure, because my partner said, no, that's not what he said. He said, but it's not. I just haven't done the work. So that's actually a question. I sort of wonder, because I haven't gone in that direction, does it mean I've been able to do something else in another direction, or I'm just missing?
There is a place in the, I think it's the first or the second chapter of conférence et recevions, where he goes like, même la pierre contemple, also
the stone,
yeah. I contemplate the world, and it's like Nietzschean metaphysics, of course, but there is, I believe there is sort of an essay, une tentative to see nature also as producing, well, not only language, but maybe also thinking. Like it goes very far, and your movement of thinking, and maybe like something we're trying to do here, I think that language is not only produced by human subjects and everything that comes before, might be also what he's trying to do. Maybe if there is something to be written in which is not too hard, are maybe the 2 first chapters of. No, it's super hard. It's hard. But I think it's maybe easier to read that than that, or I mean, maybe interesting.
Okay, I didn't get it. The 2 first chapters of what?
Of difference and repetition.
Oh, okay.
You would go back home with a reading list.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, why not?
Because,
but it's interesting because in this constellation of, we will make whatever we can make of this label, new materialism, which you've been associated with and at the same time being critical of. So perhaps you could also say a few words about that. There is like this kind of, there are some people well versed in Derrida, Karen Barat, for example, as well. And some other, it's really the Deleuzian team, like there is really, I'm thinking of, we were talking at lunch of Brian Massoumi and all this other kind of, and from an external point of view, they kind of seem very compatible, and whereas it seems that there might be from the inside a kind of incompatibility, which I'm not sure I understand precisely why.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I don't know the text enough to know.
Why?
But I have been on a panel with Brian, who's a friend of mine, and he said, I'd never heard Derrida read like that. And he liked it. So obviously his notion of Derrida was very different to mine, so there might be all manner of links. But in a way, who cares? I mean, it's a matter of wherever you find, that thing that draws you in. That's okay. So I mean, I'll certainly follow this up. But I mean, you could go Spinoza as well. I think there's a lot of stuff there.
Well, there was a question I was having whether there are other Derridians like you. I don't know how to call those Derridians, kind of Whiteheadian Derridians, or naturalistic Derridians, or you are the only one you know.
You were saying
that sounds pretty sad.
No, solitude is the condition of the absolute object. Don't worry.
I mean, obviously, you get things out of any text, so it's not as though everyone has to be the same, whatever that means anyway. But yeah, in general, I think this, you know, the nature question hasn't been opened up, and I do wonder. I don't know. I did say to Jeff Bennington, why did Derrida's stuff on genetics take till 2020 to be published? Maybe it was a little bit earlier in the French, and he said I was pushing for it. And it just seems to me, and this could be wrong, because I don't, I normally don't go to Derrida today, although I've decided I'm going to make my statement. But it seems to me, because the notion of textuality tends to be seen as philosophy or literature, the idea that you start talking about genetics and the whole thing just starts to go, and like that's why I really like that citation where he says, rethink modelling. It's in the nature of life to model itself. Now, it could do it as a positivist. It could do it in myriad ways. I think also people don't like it because it's not morally, well, where do we stand? I mean, that's why I had the stuff on Bennington at the end. You've got to think and decide where you're going to stand, instead of, you know, I'm in the good tribe and I just know I am and I use these words, so I must be okay. I think it's always moving and changing. So, but yeah, I just think Derrida's stuff, I recommend Life, Death. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And yes, there's stuff that you would have seen before.
Wow.
No idea what's going on.
Hamlet's ghost.
Such a state as ghost. Coming back at the École Normale Supérieure and saying, yes, life and death.
Well, there is something also very Nietzsche in this Derridian text that you cited.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that he was a very good reader. I'm also very surprised. I read Derrida, but not this one. and I didn't know he was to this point, Nietzsche. But he had more underlined the metaphorical Nietzsche, that everything is metaphor and interpretation. And yes, of course, everything is interpretation for Nietzsche, but because life is because life, like as perception, as will to power, and everything as incorporation, is a way to metaphorize. But the question which I always have with Nietzsche is what is first? Is life before language or before interpretation? Is there a language of life, and are science before power or power before science? Of course, both interact with each other and everything. We all know that values and language affect life, life affects language and value. But the ontological question is, what if life was only language? And yeah, this text from Derrida might be one answer to this question. And that yes, it is.
What if it was? What if it is?
Yeah, but that would be perfect for the way I want to read Nietzsche. But I'm not sure in Nietzsche, at least maybe for Derrida, of course. I don't know.
But it just depends, like what you understand language to be. Like it sounds like maybe you think that would be too restricted because you want this extra, where it's just differentiation. It's not even clear. Like it's just a riddle, a puzzle. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, but then the notion of language would maybe lose some of her characteristics, don't you think? That would be the danger, to have a very, very large notion of language. Maybe that's what we should do, but you know, if you just say it's differentiation, it's like it's a system of science, or not even a system. It's not even a system of science, not sciences, which has no limits and everything, and where every sign is in relation with another. Well, I
Yeah,
can't
but
really-
I'm not, the thing is that to me, that's too easy. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
When you say every sign is in relation to another, and people tend to be happy, oh, okay, that'll explain what's going on. I need to know about that other sign. But if the other sign is the same riddle as the first sign, then it seems to me that's why I like this notion of valeur. Like, it's how does systematicity produce anything? Like, what is it? So it seems to me you have to be, maybe it comes down to temperament. You have to be in the riddle. And I think some people want to know what's the answer. And, you know, that's fine too. But for me, I'm not, the notion of language in a Derridian sense, and I would argue even through Saussurean semiology as he gets going, I don't know what one leaves out. What is left out?
Le recul de la référence. I remember this idea that the reference is always backwards. You never reach it. You never reach the origin. You never reach the reference.
Push back.
It always goes, push back.
Yeah, I'm trying to do something else, which probably sounds odd, because there's always that sense, as I say, that you won't reach it. It will slide. This sense of a deferral, which implies we didn't quite get there where it turned. And what that for me does is it sets up that there is something, like Butler's metaphorics. I want to say it always is. I want to say the field is an ontologizing. And what one gets from that sense that you don't arrive, that sense of like cacophony and movement and dynamism, that is to me the referent.
Wow.
But it's not, I'm not saying in the Butlerian way, oh, see, so I'm still inside the closure of culture. I'm saying no outside nature means that is everywhere.
May I remark two big things? One is that it's because we start by ontologizing, or by having an ontological understanding of the concept of the sign, of the Saussurean sign, that we can then understand that there is nothing outside the text, because we've started, and it's a good, I think it's true, besides all things, I think it's actually true that signs are kinds of things. And but that is very characteristic, I think, of what you've done. And another thing which I, again, find very impressive is that in your thinking, the critical move equates the constructive move. That is, what we expect from philosophy usually is to be critical, that is, in particular, to undermine the naturalizations that we are tempted by.
Yes.
You do that. But then at the very same time, you offer in a very Deleuzian way, you might say. So the first one could be too Derridian, the next one alone would be too Deleuzian, two together are really very, very équilibré. But yeah, at the very same time as you're making this critical move, you're making a constructive or metaphysical or speculative move. So the critical and the speculative are, and we can see that in the way you're speaking, you're going always from one to the other. When it starts being too dogmatic, you're moving back to the critical move. When it starts being too critical, then say, hey, come on, we're speaking of things. So, and I think this is very specific and very rare. And I'm very admirative of that.
That was unsettling.
Yes, exactly. It makes it's really exactly. It's really philosophy itself in a way, because it's philosophy itself. Philosophy is so critical that it cannot be only critical. But thank you very much, Laurie.
Yes.
We're arriving at the end of this long session.
I'm really hot. But thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Vicki.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you online.